So welcome to another episode of Gun News Australia, brought to you by Politics Reloaded. And I have Danny Ryan from the Victorian Duck Hunters Association with me. How you doing, Danny?
Good afternoon, Neil. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. So you're on the management committee of the VDHA, and you've got quite I think a repertoire of experience in duck hunting issues, certainly in Victoria. Now, the reason why we're talking to you is about the recently released wildlife game regulations in Victoria, which I think it's fair to say is the canary in the coal mine for a whole lot of other shooting issues in this state. The duck hunting has obviously been a bit of a political football over quite a lot of years in Victoria. Just a bit of a recap of how you've seen those games played over the last couple of decades.
Oh, wow. The last couple of decades, duck hunting has been, particularly in Victoria, has had ebbs and flows with various different viewpoints, going all the way back to the Kane-Kerner era, where we started to see some of the first changes to regulations to duck hunting in Victoria. We saw reduced seasons. We saw what used to be a duck hunting season that was managed by back then was Parks, then became DNRE and so on and so forth. And then we saw further politicisation of duck hunting and quail hunting in Victoria, which then led to further restrictions and reborn and rejuvenated various game management philosophies from various government organisations, from Parks, DNRE, and now finally with game management units, and then now finally the GMA, Game Management of Victoria. So duck hunting in Victoria has had some love-hate relationship with politics and vice versa. We've seen a large cohort of duck hunters become a smaller, more dedicated cohort of duck hunters and quail hunters in particular. But I think that's sort of, that's an interesting observation to put versus deer hunting, which has had the opposite growth in the last several years, and in particular the last decade. So we've gone from being somewhere in the region of 90 to 100,000 duck hunters in Victoria circa 1978, 1980 to now just a smidgen over 25,000 duck hunters in Victoria, but from a low base of just under 20,000 only a handful of years ago, where we had a string of poor seasons or a string of no seasons. And so there's been quite adverse sets of circumstances for duck hunting in Victoria, and now we've seen a renewal of game regs for the next 10 years, but it's certainly a rocky road, and it will continue to be a rocky road. And we need to get our duck hunting fraternity, irrespective of which organisation you're a member of, or if you're not a member of organisation, you perhaps should be. We need to get everyone with the idea in their heads that it's your pastime, it's your sport, it's your adventure time, outdoor time, it's your time to bond with your family, return to nature, disconnect and unplug, to quote another organisation. And we need to get people to accept that responsibility, that they have a part to play in maintaining that. And unfortunately, as much as everyone perhaps dislikes politics, it is a political game, and you do need to be in contact with your local politicians, because the people that oppose us are every day chipping away, and they are working on gullible politicians, and more importantly, working with people behind the scenes that may not necessarily be politicians, but they're working with people behind the scenes that put an amazing amount of pressure on politicians.
Yeah, I mean, this fight's been going on for at least a couple of decades, and this has been, I guess, on the Labor State Conference agenda and taken off the agenda and left on the agenda a couple of times. And of course, there's a cohort of particularly Labor MPs out there who actually have openly opposed duck hunting. So it's putting all the issues regarding seasonality aside, the politics very much, I think, at the sharp end of the business for duck hunters.
Absolutely, yeah, and you're right. And there's been a policy within Victorian Labor for a long period of time to ban duck hunting, and it's pushed by a very small cohort of Labor politicians. And on the opposite side of the spectrum, there is a couple of politicians from Libs that also have similar personal viewpoints, and obviously now there's been some stronger action come out of Libbers and Nats in the last couple of years that are very, very clear with their support for hunting. Conversely, we've seen that particularly in the last 6 to 8 months from Victorian Labor, who support safe, sustainable and responsible hunting as well. That comes with a cost, and some of those costs are new regulations, regulations that we may be uncomfortable with, regulations that continue to chip away at some of the opportunities that we used to have that now we no longer have, which I guess we'll get to in a moment.
Yeah, I mean, what I think we're talking about isn't really just as simple as saying, Liberal good, Labor bad, or vice versa. The factional fights within the parties are significant. I mean, there's a lot of people in these parties. There are factions that are quite, in the same party, quite opposed to each other on duck hunting. I mean, that we saw that, I think, with the union standing up to support duck hunting last year. They're quite vocal about it because there was this upper house committee a review, which I'm sure you'll talk about in a second, and then there's the regulation. So just want to talk about, I think, the lead up to the Parliamentary Committee and what your takeaway from that committee process is. Not just the recommendations, but what you see as being the dynamics within that committee.
So the dynamics within that committee was very interesting, in particular, the inclusion of, and it goes both ways because there was a Shooters Fishers Farmer, Jeff Borman from Shooters Fishers Farmers Party was on that select committee, as was Georgie Purcell from the Animal Justice Party, as was, there was a Green on there as well. And then you had 3 Libs, Nats and 3 Labor people on there as well. That committee, particularly in terms of the representatives from Labor, were all metropolitan based upper house MPs, with perhaps maybe limited exposure to rural activities and certainly a very limited exposure to knowledge about hunting. I was in a key role within an organisation at that time, and we put together some very, very concrete and some very, very good arguments in terms of defending hunting, and not just ideas that had come up from previous from in that period of time, but from previous years. And the organisation had similar stances over a long period of time, but we brought in some fresh ones as well. And we campaigned very heavily, and we went into the process with a very unblinkered approach, and we were in there to represent our members in the wider hunting community. And we found that the process had chinks in it. We found that there was some people that obviously had sort of some predetermined ideas, and it was very, very difficult to cut through some of the narrative. And the thing that probably surprised me was that the limited period of time that we actually had in the consultation process, and also the limited period of time that we had in front of the committee. As one of the key organisations that ran and supported hunting with the biggest membership base of duck hunters in Victoria, and this is the previous organisation I'm talking about here, we had 1 hour in front of the consultative committee to answer questions. And whilst we did a lot of lobbying behind the scenes, 1 hour in front of the select committee was for a very important topic and subject was probably not, well, certainly wasn't enough. And then the surprise thing that surprised me even more after that was some of the quotes that came from the chairman of that committee, stating things like the evidence that we heard, and the fact that the witnesses that gave this sort of evidence. So it tried to turn the whole process into some sort of legal argument where all he heard was the opinions, and some of them sound, and obviously from us, and unsound ones from people that oppose us that had no science or bearing behind them. But then this perception that those people that he had spoken to or that had fronted in front of the committee were somehow experts in the field, when he had a number of animal activists in there and animal welfare organisations that presented very poor versions of science. And the fact that we read that published that we heard this evidence and we heard that evidence, and and it was the outcome given the outcome was even more surprising, given the fact that that select committee had a vote, and then the vote went a certain way, and then in the back of the document there were the exception reports, and the exception reports outnumbered the people that were pro-hunting, that were anti-hunting. So, and that was one of the things that we spoke about at length with various politicians post that document coming out, was you've had a select committee. The select committee's come down with this finding, but you go to the back of the book and you find that 5 out of the 9 people have exception reports in there and are actually pro safe, sustainable, responsible hunting, which confused the matter even more. Now, I don't know whether the government was at war with it, and it certainly created issues, preferably within Labor, because you had a document saying one thing, but then you had the majority of the committee were actually in support of hunting. So it was a confusing document, confusing time, but I think the government's made the correct decision to continue safe, sustainable, responsible hunting. And now we move on forward with what we've got now.
Yeah, I mean, the committee, one of the recommendations was to put an end to duck hunting. I mean, that was pretty clear, and as you indicated, the Premier's office made a call on that for their own reasons. But let's also be clear about where this committee was coming from. It was purely political. It was pushed by the Animal Justice Party. It was pushed by the RSPCA and the Greens, who were among the people you would have been sort of referring to, and some of those metropolitan-based MPs. That's the group that was polarised on the issue, and it was nothing more than just politics at work, unfortunately.
Correct. Yeah, some of those in particular key Labor politicians that come from very close inner city Melbourne seats, and certainly not any rural seats or regional seats amongst them, and they were politicians that have long held opinions on duck hunting and have just managed to, dare I say it, hang around long enough in the Victorian political system that now they are in sort of mid-level to perhaps verging on senior level positions within Victorian Labor, and then they've finally seen the light at the end of the tunnel, and thankfully the wiser heads in Vic Labor made a very strong call and a very strong decision to continue to support safe, sustainable, responsible hunting.
Are you prepared to say why they did, or sort of just perhaps a bit of a glimpse into some of
the... so there's always political connotations and political attachments, but no doubt the fact that there was a very strong submission process with a lot of key organisations, key players, big 4 build unions came out very strongly in support of outdoor recreation activities, including hunting, and that, to my knowledge, is still continuing. And I think it was a bit of a wake-up call. I think there were some people in Vic Labor that thought they would just be able to roll this over pretty quickly and carry the vote. And it was pleasantly surprising to see that the movement gathered some momentum and that it got some cut through, and that some people actually sat down and started to do a little bit of reassessment. And it was good that we had an opportunity to, as from hunting organisations and as a wider hunting community, to actually get some of the key topics out on the table, because for years and years there was internal discussions and there was discussions with people here and there, and we always had support in particular areas, but I guess it became a lay your cards on the table moment, and the cards were in our favour. Will it remain that way from here and for the next 50 years? I hope so. I hope that politicians continue to listen to constituents, and that they have respect for the fact that some people in the community choose to do things that are different from what other people in the community do. There will always be animal welfare advocates and animal welfare activists, and they will continue their campaigns. We need to be well armed, and we need to back our science and back our resolve. And a part of doing that is, as I said before, is we've got to get some people picking up their telephones and ringing their local politicians and making appointments, and make your local politician understand how important these issues are to you. And that's probably the biggest thing. And we to a point, we did that, and we mobilized our hunting community to a point. I think we need to do a better job, and certainly hunting organisations cannot relax. We have to continue forward. We have to continue fighting. I had a conversation very recently where there was a discussion about the new game regs that are already in place, and we started talking about changes to those game regs, because we don't have to wait 10 years until they sunset. We can make regulation changes as we go, and that's going to be the next argument. The next argument will be advocacy around some of the poor decisions that were made in the remake of some of the new game regs. Availability of sub-gauge, non-toxic ammunition for 28 gauge, 4, 10 and 20 gauge is going to be a major issue, major problem. Damascus barrel firearms have lost their exemptions for waterfowl hunting. It didn't need to be touched. It was there. It had been there for 20 years. Didn't need to be changed, and we've seen some people poke their fingers in, and so we'll be doing some work around some of those things. So.
Okay, so we'll get onto the regs in a sec. I know, because that's actually sort of why I sort of was keen to interview you. But just to close off on the other part, I mean, duck hunting is the canary in the coal mine for other hunting activities as well, and it also, as far as I'm concerned, is actually very important for the protection of other shooting activities in Victoria. We have to stop that tide. The tide has to stop. And you actually also made a couple of points about seeing your local MP. If you're a shooter, duck hunter or not, doesn't matter. You've got to get in the habit of doing that. You've also got to understand, when you vote, your preferences really do matter, because preferences led to the Animal Justice Party getting into the position that it got into in Parliament. And so if shooters out there want to vote pro hunting, that's great, but pay attention to your preferences. You just make up your own mind as to where they go, because if you just blindly follow how to vote cards, your vote could actually end up backing another Georgie Purcell. That's
correct, and Georgie Purcell is the example. And we saw last year she had less than 1,000 first preference votes, but she had a swag of preferences run in her favour, even from some people that maybe didn't intend their preferences to go anywhere near her, that ended up flowing towards her, and she just managed to scrape in over the line, and now there she is with her voice in Parliament.
There were some more than dirty deals done on that. There was something like 24 or whatever parties contesting the upper house, and as you know, a lot of these minor parties are part of the group that run by Glenn Jury, who's the preference whisperer, and he does a lot of trades. I
see he's just moved over to Australia's Voice, so it'll be interesting. And the words that Fatima Payman used last night in her ABC interview was that he is her chief of staff. So it'll be interesting to see how he's going to continue to do both roles.
Yeah, if he lasts, because I have seen footage of him actually wandering around in the back of the office when she was being interviewed. This was a while ago now. But what happened there is when you look at the votes that came out of the last election, half those 24 odd parties went straight to Animal Justice Party, and there weren't a dozen deals to be on the table. So they had made promises to a whole lot of other people. They reneged on the deal with Glenn Jury, and they reneged on deals with a whole lot of other people. They got away with it once. So
yeah.
Let's see how it goes.
We have to be vigilant, and we have to be very, very, very sure that people are aware of that going into the next election in particular, because the AJP are not going away. If you analyse the AJP vote from the last Victorian election, and you have a close look at lower house seats, and then you have a close look at upper house seats where they fielded candidates everywhere, that's going to be an issue, and they're not going to go away. They'll probably have the same candidates return, and they'll run the same we love our cats and dogs program that they ran in the last one. And, we know the voting demographic that they appeal to. And that's a very tough demographic for hunting organisations or outdoor rec organisations to touch base with or have some sort of relationship with, given that particular demographic that was a high percentage of her vote. But it's going to take some due diligence on our behalf, that's for sure.
Yeah, I will be covering the voting issue in more detail later on. I'm going to be drubbing this home until people are just absolutely sick and tired of the message, but they'll get the message because that's why we're having this discussion now. So we moved from the committee process to the regulations, which came into effect recently, and you've touched on a couple of the, I think, the features of those regulations. The Damascus barrels, that is the banning of lead so there's no exemptions for them. Banning of lead ammo out in the field.
Except for deer hunting. You can still use lead ammunition for deer hunting.
Which is kind of strange. I'm interested to know why that happened, but let's not go down that path. Tell me what else is in the regulations that hunters, particularly duck hunters, need to know about.
So the key one is we're moving to a new adaptive harvest model for determining of bag limits. So that's actually listed in the game regs now in some areas. There is also some more new things that are listed, such as use of non-toxic shot for not only native game birds, but non-Indigenous game birds as well. So if you manage to get an invite or a booking for a walked up shoot on partridge or pheasants or one of those sort of type game days, that there's now that toxic shot regulation now exists for non-Indigenous game birds as well. There's very succinct and clear regulations in around possession of toxic shot whilst hunting game birds as well. So it's very clear that you cannot possess lead shot while you're hunting game birds. So gone are the days of having a few BBs in your belt while you're out quail shooting, and if you see a fox, you can no longer shoot that fox. So there's some little issues around there. Obviously, the exemptions for Damascus barrels is now gone for waterfowl. We still see a maximum of 10 birds for bag limits for duck and 20 birds for quail. And given some of the statuses around how the adaptive harvest model is meant to work, that should not be there. And there's some other little key issues. So one of the other ones was electronic game callers. So we fought to get an exemption for electronic game callers for duck, and that one's come through. So a few wins and a few losses. If you ask me, I think the losses outweigh the wins. Positives to take away from the game regs, obviously 10 years of game regs. So hunting from 2024 to 2034 before we remake the game regs again.
And opening times.
Oh, opening times, yes, correct. That's another one. So 5 days of opening times at 8 a.m. for the first 5 days of the season. Animal activists can't come on the water until 11 a.m. So that just reinforces that 3-hour buffer window. They won't do that, of course. They will still break the law. They'll still enter the water and they'll still surround you and wave flags and whistles. There won't be a rescue net anywhere in sight, and they'll just be there to hinder, harass hunters, as we've seen them do continually over the last couple of years, a smaller cohort of anti-hunting activists. And Wednesday opening, unfortunately, that one was one that was championed by some people within various government departments that in love with Wednesday opening idea. We campaigned for, at the very minimum, if it wasn't going to be a Saturday, we campaigned for a Friday. The Wednesday opening is very detrimental and is very hard for the majority of hunters to get that time available to go to a Wednesday opening. So we campaigned against that one. Other things in the game regs, the game regs are very clear now in terms of opening of the season, closing of the season. So that's a positive, full 91, 92 days, third Saturday in March to the second Monday in June. So good to see that. That again creates a very solid set of numbers for a minister to look at when they're making determinations about adaptive harvest models and things like that. So it's good to see that there is a solid 3 and a bit months of duck hunting season available for everyone, and no major changes to quail other than the exception that quail callers are now banned in the regulations, and that they are now moving to non-toxic shot effective 2025, which is disappointing. No phase-in time or anything like that. So,
blue-wing shovelers, I think, are still game species, but there's a closed season on them.
Correct. So blue-wing shoveler is one that I picked up very early on, and it's going to take a little bit of work. I know there's a couple of organisations doing some work on blue-wing shovelers at the moment, but they have been retained on the game list. However, the status of them says protected for the whole of each year.
Yeah.
That is going to be a difficult one, even with red hot, rock solid science. It is going to take mountains to get blue wing back on a game list again. And it's going to take quite a lot of due diligence from hunting organisations and scientists to actually say, here we are, here's our stable base population of blue wing shoveler, and we can quite comfortably take 2 birds per day during the season and not affect the base rate of sustainable population of blue wing shoveler. The blue wing shoveler have always had small populations. We've seen hardhead. Hardhead's a very nomadic bird, comes and goes in and out of Victoria in the space of 24, 48 hours sometimes. So, hardhead might show up in 30,000 of them for 3 days, and then they're gone, they're headed somewhere else. So, we see the Eastern Area Waterbird Survey, hardhead all the way up the top in Queensland, and then all of a sudden there's none anywhere, and all of a sudden everyone's yelling and screaming that hardhead are going to be extinct or this, or the numbers have plummeted, but then all of a sudden 50,000 of them turn up in Darwin, or 50,000 of them turn up in the middle of the outback in Lake Eyre or somewhere like that. So again, and that's the use of science, and science is great when it's working as it should, and everyone pays close attention and understands the background behind the science. But unfortunately, when you get a printed set of numbers in front of career bureaucrats that sit in an office that have maybe not been outside of metropolitan Melbourne for several years, and all they look at is raw numbers on pieces of paper and don't actually understand that because there's a flood in the New South Wales Riverina and it's not within a transect that Kingsford counts, all of a sudden we've got this massive plummeting number of birds, which has been our argument for years and years and years, and duck hunters understand it and outdoorsmen understand it. We know that populations are transient, particularly Australian native game birds are very transient, but it's interesting, and it's quite difficult to get that message through sometimes.
Just a couple of last things I think is, I've seen some people say these regulations are a win. Now, they're not a complete loss. I mean, it's a question of whether you look at them as a glass half full or half empty. I don't see them as a win. We have lost ground here again. Yes, it could have been worse, and there are some things which we might say, it's good that certain things have been retained, but I still see it as a loss.
Look, Neil, it's a very, very interesting one, and look at glass half empty, glass half full. So I agree. There's some key losses, and there's some losses that will, rightly so, get some people thinking that, hang on, this have been some poor decisions made in the process here. We've seen some decisions that are perhaps being lost in translation from politicians through to the department, through to the execution and the writing of the regulations. We've seen perhaps a misinterpretation of the intent of that. We've seen some decisions made that didn't need to be made, basically. So there were some things, and there was some considerations that were well presented, and in the various submissions from different organisations and different people that were presented in response to the regulatory impact statement that have basically been ignored. Now, we had every key anti-hunting organisation still had input into the regulatory impact statement, and still got a voice as an end user, even though their key single line, we want to ban hunting. My personal viewpoint and the viewpoint of the VDHA is that once that viewpoint is known, that should end the consultation process with anti-hunting organisations with government departments. So for government department counts, RSPCA, Wildlife Victoria, Coalition Against Duck Shooting, Animals Australia, they count them as an end user, and their only goal is to end duck hunting. That's the beginning and the end of the consultation process, as far as I'm concerned.
It's not about facts, and it's only about politics.
Correct.
And I often use the analogy that, you know, if I had a view on aviation safety and went out there and sort of lobbied government about it, the first question would be, well, what are your qualifications and experience? Do you know anything about aviation safety? No, I'm just a person with a view.
I think jets are noisy, and they should make them quieter, you know. Yeah.
It's like the Gun Safety Alliance over in WA. I keep thinking, you know what, they call themselves Gun Safety Alliance, they do a lot of, you know, sort of lobbying about it, but if you put a loaded 22 on the table in front of them and you say, okay, make that gun safe.
No idea.
They wouldn't probably shoot themselves in the foot. The minister, you mentioned the minister, who is Steve Dimopoulos.
Steve Dimopoulos, yes.
He's a member for Oakley, which if you're outside Melbourne is not exactly, you know, regional. It's a high ethnic population, but it's just a metro area, and I think this is
in a city metro seat.
Yeah, one of those influences we can't ignore, because it's the minister's, when it comes to regulations, it's the minister's call. So you talk about wanting to remake the regulations going forward. Obviously, some of that will be dependent upon who the minister of the day is.
Oh, yes, correct. But the minister still relies on a department in the background, and there's certainly some key themes during the regulatory impact statement process. There were some key themes that were running from within the department, and you touched on it just before. Interestingly, it creates a headache for government, and that the particular headache is toxic shot and lead. So we've had in the regulatory impact statement, it was very clear that there was some people within the department that had a very strong view on non-toxic projectiles for deer, and that disappeared during the course of the regulatory impact statement. There's everyone jumped up and down and said no. You know, the technology is not there, and a swathe of very good science-based arguments around that. But then the government fully adopted a ban on lead shot for all native game birds, and including non-Indigenous game birds, based on zero science. So it's a perplexing situation, I guess, now for government, given the fact that 2,500 direct licensed quail shooters versus 48,000 or 50-odd thousand licensed deer hunters. So that'll be a question that we will continue to put to government, and we'll be having a look at, you know, how that process was run, and why that process managed to get as far as it did and get all the way through. Yeah, we've got a set of regulations now that we've got. The worst outcome for that was simply for the guys that shoot sub-gauge, the lack of availability of ammunition around the world, and because we have really no sub-gauge shotgun shotgun cartridge manufacturing in this country. Everything's imported, and our market, and we're out on Victoria as a state is out on its own on this issue worldwide. Let's not make no mistake about that. There's certain moves with waterfowl in Europe, and certainly in America is a federal mandate on steel shot for waterfowl in America from 1992, and we adopted that in Australia. But when you look at America, there is the vast, there's only 8 states that have a ban or a partial ban on the use of lead projectiles or lead shot. One of them is California's got a ban on everything lead. But other than the state of California, Victoria now becomes the only other state in any country in the world that has a ban on lead shot for upland game bird hunting. There are many states in the US. So there's more than 43 or 44 states in America that had the option to ban lead shot for upland game bird hunting since the federal mandate on waterfowl since 1992, some 32 years, and none of them have implemented a ban on lead shot for upland game bird shooting. But yet here in Victoria, we've got some people that, you know, that was their key driver, and that's what we've ended up with. So, and the disappointing thing is that our market is so small that we may never see steel shot in a 410 or a non-toxic shot in a 410 cartridge, so that someone can go and use perhaps an heirloom 410 that they've had handed down through their family, or perhaps a new one they bought 6 months ago. And same for 28 gauge and things like that. And then we move on in the same vein as that. We move on to English game guns with 2.5-inch chambers. So it is highly unlikely that there will be suitable non-toxic shot products or non-toxic shot cartridges available for those 2.5-inch chambered guns in the near future. Certainly not within the time frame that this legislation comes into effect next year. And that effectively makes all of those firearms obsolete. Now, in the regulatory impact statement, the department said, but you can go out and you can buy another firearm from anywhere between $900 and $1,200. Now, if that single sentence doesn't show the disconnect between people in the department and actual reality out there in the real world where people go hunting, you simply cannot buy a shotgun for $900 to $1,200 that is anywhere near the quality or anywhere near the handling specifications of an existing side-by-side shotgun with 2.5-inch chambers, or a sub-gauge over and under shotgun. So the big disconnect there, and that is one of the key things that are making people very upset, and rightly so. Really, it just comes down to engaging people and getting them politically active, and yeah, really, VDHA will continue to advocate. We're purely an advocacy organisation. That's all we do. We're looking at doing some key science projects in some key areas, specifically targeting a couple of things. And I won't divulge too much more about that at the moment, because there'll be other people out there that will say it was their idea. But you know, there's some long-running stuff that's going on in the background. But yeah, really, it's about engagement, and it's about recognising the fact that there are some things to celebrate. And I'm big on celebrating the things that we've done and we've achieved. And I think 10 years of game regs is, considering where we were with the select committee report on 30th of August last year in 2023, where the key recommendation was to ban native game bird hunting in Victoria. We've now got a set of regulations. When I look nationwide, and when I look internationally as well, but when I look nationwide, we see Victoria now has the opportunity, and I mention this every time I talk to politicians, Victoria now has the opportunity to grow. You've made a commitment to safe, sustainable, responsible hunting. We've seen what other states are doing. Northern Territory in particular, with their new government up there, are doing some amazing things with hunting in such a very, very short space of time. They made some electoral promises to expand and create more hunting reserves. And they've been on the phone already to some key people up there in the Northern Territory saying, right, this is what we've highlighted, and this is the area we think we're going to open. We want to open it in time for the goose season. And that was only last week. So we've got some very active and some very far and forward thinking activities going on in places like the Northern Territory. We've seen South Australia cement their support for hunting without some of the onerous regulations that Victoria's put in. We've seen Victoria come up with 10 years of game reg, which is fine. We've seen Tasmania continue on with the game regs and the hunting culture that they have in Tasmania, and with the exception of a very small cohort of anti-hunting people down there, pretty much it's business as usual in Tasmania. Obviously, we all know that in New South Wales, they still have the DPI management program for hunting game birds or hunting ducks, particularly on rice crops and for crop protection. In Queensland, there's still an authority-controlled wildlife system up there as well, and you can control ducks as pests. But you know, the smart intel on Queensland is that they just do what they want to do when they want to do it. It's just the manner and the way they do things. In WA, In spite of being touted as banned duck hunting in 1994 or 1992, whenever it was, there's plenty of hunting still going on in Western Australia as well. The vast majority of it under authority to control wildlife systems and some not. So, I think that Victoria now has the opportunity to look forward and work off this base that we've got now. And that's one of the things we'll be doing when we advocate. We'll be making sure that the government is keeping their finger on the pulse and that we're actually doing things to create opportunity for hunting in Victoria. One of the key things we need to advocate for and change is some of the key roles of the Game Management Authority, and particularly in regards to promotion of hunting. And we'd look to New Zealand in the way that New Zealand Fish and Wildlife look after hunting and hunting promotion in New Zealand. You see billboards paid for by government departments on the sides of highways in New Zealand, giving you a countdown for when duck opening is and things like that. So we'd like to see the GMA do a little bit more, but they're currently restricted by the regulation in terms of the creation of that particular government department. So we'll be advocating for some change around that. And then internationally, obviously, Australia could be a hunting destination for international shooters. There's some variations to game regs in there in terms of wit tests and things like that. So there'll be obviously some work going on there. And we'd obviously extend an invitation to international hunters to come to Australia and do some hunting.
Yeah, and this is not just wishful thinking. This is stuff that actually does exist overseas, can be done here, and it's just a change of mindset, and it would make such a big difference. You talk about Northern Territory. I think they've also the commitment, which I think was announced by Gerard Maley, who's very much a hunter himself, to lock in hunting. I think it was geese hunting times for 5 years.
5 years of 5 years of set bag limits.
How good would that be?
So that they can confidently then assess the science that surrounds the bag limits and whether bag limits influence populations and sustainable populations of birds as it goes on, because it's shown year after year after year in the territory that, and the territory is an interesting one, given the fact that the magpie goose nesting season is heavily reliant on rainfall. So, and whether they have a wet or a dry wet heavily influences hatching and fledging of magpie geese and so on and so forth. Not too dissimilar to other parts of Australia, but there's more consistent seasonal activity up in the north. So it's going to start raining there in November, and it generally doesn't stop raining until late February or late January at the least. So,
which also means the businesses can plan for that.
That's the other key thing too for industry. We saw it was actually interesting because the industry didn't really get too heavily involved in the native game bird process. There was a couple of small submissions from some individuals here and there. I was from some industry people here and there. But by the fight was mainly led by the organisations. So, one of the key things for industry going forward will be, now the option for those guys to look at the advances and look at the conditions for the coming year and be confident in the fact that they know if they've got XYZ amount of pellets of steel shot cartridges or non-toxic shot cartridges, might be bismuth, might be tungsten, nickel iron, they can actually go and order that product and have that product available for hunters and confidently have that product in stock, knowing that they're not going to get caught with $250,000 worth of outlay of something that they might not be able to sell next year. So,
And finally, just to cover off on the Victorian Duck Hunters Association, I've just got your membership page here. It's really worth any shooter out there who is involved in duck hunting or thinking about getting involved in hunting. Or duck hunting in particular, definitely worth going to your website, because if you become a member, you've got public liability insurance, you've got access to the VDHA updates on getting the information you need to know, where can you go and when, and some of the other rules that might govern your seasons. Support during disputes with activists, so you get shoot fronted, and representation during decision-making processes, and participation in organised hunts and mentoring. So and that's all for $80 a year. So that's an awful lot to get for really what is a little bit more than a carton of beer.
Yes, yes, exactly right. And the interesting one with that one, Neil, is there was a process during the select committee where there was a suggestion, in particular from one member of that parliamentary committee, that there should be compulsory membership of a hunting organisation. And it's interesting that that was the one key recommendation that got left out of the whole process, because obviously, if we have every single licensed duck hunter in Victoria compulsorily has to be a member of a hunting organisation, that would strengthen hunting organisations. So there's a very salient point for the listeners and watchers to recognise that, and you can put your 1 and 1 together and get 10. So so there's a reason why they didn't make that one of the compulsory ones. So.
Yes.
But by all means, join VDHA. Have a look. VDHA does have a lot to offer. It's a very slimline, very succinct and to the point organisation, concentrating on advocacy. And we're out there to fight for you. But at the same time, like I said earlier several times, you also need to fight for yourself as well. So we encourage you to get on the phone and ring your local MP, let them know what you're thinking.
Indeed. Okay, Danny Ryan, look, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. It's been a great
pleasure as
talk.
always.
Okay.